Ever wondered why almost every elevator in the world is lined with mirrors? It isn't for checking your teeth or fixing your hair. It's a calculated psychological trick to manipulate your brain. Architects realize that by forcing you into a moment of self-reflection, they could literally make time feel like it's moving faster. And the story of how this hack was discovered? It starts in post-war New York City, in a building full of furious tenants, a room full of stumped engineers, and one quietly brilliant psychologist who had never thought about elevators a day in his life. Picture New York City just after World War II. America is booming. The skyline is shooting upward. Offices are filling up with workers. And in one large office tower in Manhattan, something was going very, very wrong. The tenants were complaining, loudly, constantly, aggressively. The problem? The elevators. They were slow, painfully, embarrassingly slow during peak hours. The wait times were stretching far beyond what anyone considered acceptable. Tenants threatened to break their leases. Some already had one foot out the door. Management was running out of time, so they did what any sensible organization would do. They brought in the experts. A specialist engineering firm was hired to analyze the system. After weeks of study, they came back with a verdict. The elevators were operating at around 6 times below the American standard for a building of this size. Their proposed solutions? Add new elevator shafts, replace the old cars with faster models, install a computerized routing system to balance the load. All technically viable, all extraordinarily expensive, and none of them practical in an aging building that wasn't built to be torn apart. The engineers shrugged. We can't fix it, they said. Learn to live with it. In desperation, the building manager called a meeting of his entire staff. Every department head showed up. Ideas were floated. Ideas were shot down. The session deteriorated into arguments. Proposals were torn apart the moment they left someone's lips. And sitting quietly at the far end of the table was a young man who hadn't said a word. He was barely out of university. He'd been sent in place of the head of personnel who couldn't make it. He was new junior and completely out of his depth, at least by the standards of everyone else in that room. But he had a psychology degree. And while everyone else was arguing about motors and cables and shafts, he had been sitting there asking himself a completely different question. Why, he thought, are people so angry about a wait that only lasts a few minutes? That one question changed everything. When the manager finally turned to him, half out of desperation, the young man spoke. He said the problem wasn't the elevator. The problem was boredom. People trapped in a metal box with nothing to look at, nothing to do, and nothing to focus on except the silent question of how long this was going to take. Those people weren't experiencing a mechanical failure. They were experiencing a psychological one. Their minds were idle. And an idle mind, as science would later confirm in exhaustive detail, is a time-distorting machine. His solution? Don't fix the elevator. Fix the experience of waiting for it. And his specific suggestion was almost laughably simple. Put mirrors in the elevator lobbies, not to make the space look bigger, not for aesthetics, but to give people something to do, something they would instinctively do without even realizing they were doing it. Let them look at themselves. Let them glance at others without appearing to. Give the brain a task. The manager wasn't convinced, but the installation cost almost nothing, so he said yes. The mirrors went up, and the complaint stopped almost overnight, not just reduced. Stopped. In fact, in one of the more extraordinary details of this story, some of the same tenants who had been threatening to break their leases actually congratulated management on the improved elevator service. The elevators, of course, had not changed by a single second. This story was first documented and told publicly by Dr. Russell L. Akoff, one of the most influential systems thinkers and operations researchers in American history. A Wharton School professor who spent decades arguing that the most important skill in problem solving isn't finding the right answer, but asking the right question. He called what happened in that building dissolving a problem, not solving it with brute force, but reframing it so completely that it ceases to exist. The engineers had seen a mechanical problem. The psychologists had seen a human one. And in that single distinction lay the entire secret. To understand why mirrors work, you have to understand something deeply uncomfortable about the human brain. It has no reliable internal clock. Unlike your eyes, which detect light, or your ears, which detect sound, your brain has no dedicated sensory organ for the passage of time. It constructs the experience of time from other signals, from how much is happening around you, from how engaged your attention is, from how many new pieces of information you're processing, which means your experience of time is not objective. It is not fixed. It is deeply, profoundly malleable. Research published in scientific reports confirm this directly. Time perception is fundamentally subjective and depends entirely on a person's experiences and circumstances. Moments of excitement compress. Moments of boredom stretch. The same 10 minutes can feel like a blink or an eternity, depending entirely on what your brain is doing with it. Here's exactly what happens to your brain when you're waiting with nothing to do, with no external stimulation process. Your mind defaults to the only thing left available, monitoring time itself. Neuroscientists and psychologists call this respective timing, the state where your attentional resources are almost entirely occupied by tracking how long something is taking. And the more attention you dedicate to the passage of time, the slower time appears to move. You're essentially watching a pot boil, using your entire conscious mind as a pot watcher. A peer-reviewed study published in Frontiers in Psychology laid this out plainly. When a person has nothing to focus on, most of their available attentional resources are redirected toward monitoring time. Here's where the elevator mirror story stops being clever and starts being genuinely fascinating. When you look at yourself in a mirror, your brain doesn't treat it as a simple visual input. It triggers something far more complex and far more cognitively demanding. Psychologists call it objective self-awareness, a state studied extensively by Shelley Duvall and Robert Wicklund, whose landmark 1972 research established that mirrors immediately shift a person's attention inward toward the self as an object of social evaluation. In a state of objective self-awareness, you are simultaneously the observer and the observed. You begin evaluating how you look. You compare your current appearance to your mental image of how you want to look. You adjust, you refine, you assess whether your posture, your expression, your presentation are meeting some internal standard you didn't even know you were holding. The key ingredient wasn't vanity. It was simply recognition. The moment your brain registers that you're the thing in front of you, and from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes complete sense. Self-monitoring is survival critical. How do I appear others? Am I projecting status? Am I presenting a threat? Does something look wrong? These are ancient, powerful questions. Your brain treats them as urgent, far more urgent in evolutionary terms than how long you've been standing in a lobby. Once the mirror solution demonstrated its power, it didn't stay in one New York building. The insight spread, first through the operations research community, the discipline Russellikoff helped build, then into architecture schools and building design firms across the world. By the second half of the 20th century, mirrors and elevators had become so standard that they stopped being a conscious psychological intervention and became simply the way elevators looked. But the real legacy of that post-war building wasn't mirrors and elevators. It was the idea that the perception of a problem can be solved separately from the problem itself, and that often solving perception is all you ever needed. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you see the world. The elevator was never actually the problem. The experience of the elevator was the problem. And those are two completely different things. Next time you step into an elevator and catch your own eye in the mirror, just for a half second, just instinctively, remember what's actually happening. You're not being vain. You're being managed. Because more than 70 years ago, a young psychologist in a post-war New York office building figured out that there is nothing in the world your brain finds more irresistible than its own face. And someone used that knowledge to make a problem disappear, not by solving it, by making you forget it existed. If this changed how you see the spaces around you, share it with someone who rides elevators every day. Because now, every mirror you walk past is going to hit a little differently.